So good day, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us. Now, on Tuesday, the 7th of June 2022, CRAN officially launched the National SIM Registration Consumer Awareness Campaign, which aims to educate the public on the importance of the registration of SIM cards in Namibia. Now, of course, the aforementioned is as a result of the new regulations of Part 6 of the Communications Act that were approved last year in March and that require all mobile users to then register their SIM cards to gain access to network services. Now, public interest in this particular discussion is very high, as expected, and the question of what the new regulations ultimately mean for the everyday Namibian has come up here and there. And this has then necessitated the need for this discussion. Now, this platform wouldn't be Ask the Experts if there were no experts. So joining me today to dissect this topic, of course, we have Ms. Emilia Nghikembua, the Chief Executive Officer of the Communications Regulatory Authority of Namibia, better known as CRAN. Ms. Emilia, good day and thank you so much for being here.
Good afternoon, Rosvita, and thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Joining us again today, we also have investigative journalist Shinovene Immanuel, who heads the Namibian newspaper's investigative unit. Shinovene, can you hear me? Am I audible? Welcome.
Thank you. And pleased to be part of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And last but not least, we have Mr. John Nakuta, who is a human rights law lecturer at the University of Namibia and who also serves as the current Media Ombudsman for the Editors Forum of Namibia.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very much excited to be part of this very important discussion.
So that is our season panel for today. Thank you so much for joining us once again. And since we are pressed for time, we only have 1 hour to dissect this topic. We will just dive right in. And I see we have a couple of participants that have also just joined. So I think now is the perfect time to just dive right into it. So I believe the obvious starting point will obviously to this discussion would then be the why, right? So why are these regulations coming into place? Like, what has necessitated Namibia finally joining the multiple scores of countries that have also had SIM registration? And I think this I will direct to Ms. Emilia, if that's okay, to just start us off as to why Namibia has decided to go the SIM registration route and what has necessitated that.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I think the why is really so that we can give effect to the provisions of the Communications Act. The Act came into force in 2011, and that part that deals with SIM registration, amongst many other requirements, has not yet been operationalized, and it's because we've literally spent about 10 years crafting the regulations, trying to perfect them. There was a lot of back and forth and a lot of hiccups, but we are pleased that finally the regulations have been finalized, the conditions have also been finalized, and this is why we have then started with the process of implementing the SIM registration requirement, or at least making it a mandatory requirement as far as our service providers are concerned.
Thank you. Now, according to the regulations, service providers would be required to keep consumers' data for a period of at least 5 years, correct? Now,
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very much excited to be part of this very important discussion.
So that is our season panel for today. Thank you so much for joining us once again. And since we are pressed for time, we only have 1 hour to dissect this topic. We will just dive right in. And I see we have couple of participants that have also just joined, so I think now is the perfect time to just dive right into it. So I believe the obvious starting point will obviously to this discussion would then be the why, right? So why are these regulations coming into place? Like, what has necessitated Namibia finally joining the multiple scores of countries that have also had SIM registration? And I think this I will direct to Ms. Emilia, if that's okay, to just start us off as to why Namibia has decided to go the SIM registration route and what has necessitated that.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I think the why is really so that we can give effect to the provisions of the Communications Act. The Act came into force in 2011, and that part that deals with SIM registration, amongst many other requirements, has not yet been operationalized, and it's because we've literally spent about 10 years crafting the regulations, trying to perfect them. There was a lot of back and forth and a lot of hiccups, but we are pleased that finally the regulations have been finalized, the conditions have also been finalized, and this is why we have then started with the process of implementing the SIM registration requirement, or at least making it a mandatory requirement as far as our service providers are concerned.
Thank you. Now, according to the regulations, service providers would be required to keep consumers' data for a period of at least 5 years, correct? Now, what type of data exactly are we talking about that service providers would then be expected to retain? And what happens to the data after the requisite time period for retention has expired? So what data is being retained and what happens afterwards?
Okay, so the data that is being retained is firstly that we need to know the identity of each SIM card holder. So you would have to register in terms of what is your name, your address, your telephone number, and where you live and so forth. So that type of data must be registered. Then the second layer of data that must be captured is who did you call, what time did you call them, for how long did you speak, what type of applications did you visit on the internet, and so forth. So that is the type of data that must be kept for a period of 5 years. And what happens after 5 years is that it can then be destroyed because it's no longer required. I also just want to clarify that the data that is being captured or stored is currently already stored. This is why if you go to a service provider and you ask them to say, I've received a bill of $10,000, can you show me how I arrived at the $10,000? They will generate for you what they call an itemized bill. And everything on the itemized bill is what the conditions are now making a mandatory requirement. Whilst it's currently happening just out of the business operations of the operators, the new conditions would now make it mandatory. But the data is actually already being stored. And the only additional requirement that comes in now is the 5-year requirement, whilst currently without the mandatory requirement, the operators were storing the data, but they would have different policies in terms of for how long do you retain it.
Okay, thank you so much, Emilia. Next, I'd like to move on to Mr. John, if that's fine. Now, the right to privacy is a fundamental cornerstone for any democratic regime, correct? Especially in the digital age. Now, concerns surrounding these regulations have usually been attributed to the right of privacy. So I believe it's just fair then to then ask that do you believe that these regulations in any way interfere with the right to privacy? Mr. Nakuta?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Not just only, thank you for the question, not only just the right to privacy, but obviously very central to this is indeed the right to privacy. But the regulations and the idea of the proposed mandatory SIM regulation pose a risk, a grave risk to a host of rights. And of course, you've mentioned the right to privacy, but one could also mention the right to freedom of expression and access to information, as well as the right to association. Because the major concern with the idea of mandatory registration of SIM cards is that really it can be used to target, profile, and do surveillance on behalf of government against those government considers as political opponents. And we are not saying it is now, but it is having the potential for it to be used by rogue government officials against human rights defenders, for example, political opponents, those that are considered to talk too much, and of course, journalists. And so it is in this context that we are saying the proposed SIM or mandatory SIM card registration is really, really poses a lot of human rights issues of concerns. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. Now, other concerns that have been echoed around this, and I'll build up on your answer later, but I think another facet that I wanted to bring in the discussion is that there have been concerns that have been echoed about the regulations being implemented in the absence of a data protection law and how that might be a bit premature. So what would your views or your thoughts be on that, on the regulations being implemented in the absence of a data protection law, which would be the framework that would then to a very large degree inform how practically on the ground these regulations would work?
Yes, you're very much right, Rosvita. Another concern about the proposed data mandatory SIM card registration is exactly what you've just mentioned, the legal void, because we currently do not have a comprehensive privacy and data protection legal framework in place. So as such, the proposed mandatory SIM card registration is thus, as I already said, introduced in a legal void. And so in the absence of a comprehensive data protection legislation and oversight, therefore the SIM card users' identification information can therefore be shared and even matched with other private and public databases, enabling the state to create a comprehensive profile of individuals and citizens, and enabling companies and even third parties to access a vast amount of data. And that is concern. We can't be told, because the Communication Act already provides for that. So we are basically implementing what the law allows us to do. No, there is a legal void. And in fact, if you really want to do it, address those legitimate concerns about the legal void that we are currently having.
Now, Shinovene, I would like to move to you, because some of the concerns that Mr. Nakuta has spoken of are concerns that directly impact you in the profession that you work. So I would like to pose the next question to you to ask, how will this introduction of these regulations then affect journalists, given that privacy is critical to journalists' capacity to thoroughly investigate cases?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. Just to start off, I think I just want. I think it's quite a good thing to probably start off by saying that I really like the fact that CRAN has started a campaign to educate the public about misconception that probably even some of the citizens will have, including journalists, including activists. That even though I have a slight reservation about the title of the campaign, because the campaign is SIM card registration, and when you just heard Emilia there explaining what actually Section 6 includes, it includes issues such as storage of data. So, which I think that is a huge component of the campaign, because if you want to explain to the public what is the key issue, why are we on this campaign, I would rather want to hear what is the main motive around the storage of the data, even though Emilia says that has been happening already. I think it's very crucial to that campaign that at the moment is mostly centered around SIM card registration, which in any democracy in any country should be done. So I would probably want CRAN to do more in terms of providing more information on the storage of data. As relating to how it affects us and how it affects journalists, I think it's one thing that we have for years raised as an issue, that blanket storage of data, whether it's currently being done already because by service providers, depending on their policies. Our concern is that it might not happen now, but in a ruthless, unethical leadership, political leadership, it will really be a loophole that will be used against journalists, against their sources. At the moment, it could happen that it's not happening. That's just because we're probably a bit lucky, or it's already happening and people are being victimized, either at work, all of a sudden, a person is being victimized just because all of a sudden somebody has picked up data from MTC on who they called. It turns out maybe they were just calling out of curiosity, you know. But I think it's a huge issue, especially that could have a dent on Namibia's media ranking as a free country in terms of press, journalism, and digital communication. But I think it's one of those, I won't probably pinpoint on the key issues, but I think Frederico Lins has really explained it well on the fact that it affects journalists, their sources, doctors, their patients, lawyers, and their clients, so much that that data could easily be used against them, even especially, let's say it's a political year, they have congresses, you just see medical records being leaked out for political gains, and that's not what we want. I hope I did explain a bit on that.
Okay. Emilia, Shinovene mentioned something there that I'm not sure if you wanted to respond to, or if we should rather just continue. I know we wanted to get into the SIM card registration awareness campaign later on, but I was wondering if you wanted to respond to the question that he posed as it relates to data storage and how this awareness campaign is just on the SIM card registration.
Okay, thank you. I think the first thing is that the SIM registration, that is the primary focus, in the sense that come the 1st of January next year, consumers will be required to register. But when you look at the elements of the actual campaign, they then sort of unravel the whole regulation pertaining to storage of data, the requirements for registration, and all of that. So Shinovene is quite right in that it is titled SIM registration, but the actual campaign material is targeted at unraveling and sensitizing the public on all the elements that are introduced in the conditions, including the storage of data. The second issue is this. There's been a lot of talk about surveillance and this and that. And I really just want to clarify that the SIM registration conditions do not introduce interception. Neither the conditions nor the regulations that were imposed by the minister introduce interception. Interception has been happening in Namibia since the year 1997 under the NCIS Act. That is the law that authorizes interception, and it sets out the procedure to be followed when interception is taking place. Secondly, the mandatory requirement is really only extending the SIM registration process to prepaid customers. Because if you are a postpaid customer, your SIM is already registered. Now, if you are a journalist, for instance, and you have an 0811 number, then it means that the operators know who you are. And in terms of the NCIS Act, that process is already there. So we must be careful not to conflate SIM registration with interception, because those are totally two different processes. The concerns around the data protection laws are true, but the Communications Act is not the only act that authorizes the retention of data. The Banking Act authorizes the retention of data. The Financial Services Act authorizes the retention of data, and many other laws. And all of that data is retained in the absence of a data protection law. And I think some of those laws even retain data that is much broader than the Communications Act authorizes. So the call for the data protection laws to be finalized, I think we are converted as far as that is concerned. We are pushing for that, but we must not paint a picture that it's going to be, there's a gap just because we are now retaining data, or we are making the retention of the data mandatory, because most of that data is already being is already being,
Retained.
It's already being retained. So it's nothing unique to the it's nothing unique to the communications industry, because the banks have what we call know your customer. Know your customer is registration of customers, and they give a broader avenue of information compared to what is being required under the Communications Act. So the issues of media freedom might be founded, but I don't want us to create a perception that now, because the SIM will be registered, media freedom would be taken away, because a lot of journalists would have 111 numbers, but their media freedom has not been affected for the past 25 years. And the interception law is already there. And as a matter of fact, interception is already taking place in Namibia. We've had many cases where the police would go to a judge, get the warrant, go to one of the service providers, MTC Telecom Operators, and obtain that information. Who did this person call? Who does this number belong to? And in instances where the operators, it's a 111 number, they'll be able to reveal that identity. So this is already happening, and we must just be cognizant not to create the perception that once it's introduced, media freedom will be taken away. The other issue is, let us remember that there is 155 countries across the globe that are doing SIM registration. On the African continent, we are the last 2 countries that are not doing SIM registration. And I want us to look at the media ranking and look at the countries that are ranked as number 1, and then look at whether they have mandatory SIM registration, so that the arguments that we put across are a bit more empirical than just giving a blanket provision to say the rights will be affected. The last intervention that I wanted to give on this particular issue is to say that the law is very clear. If there is to be interception, the law is clear on how interception must happen. And if that process is not being followed, then the courts are still there for us to test and say, are these provisions constitutional? Are they unconstitutional? That process can still be followed. It's the same thing that happened in South Africa. Part of their law was struck down because somebody actually challenged it. So I think that's just my few interventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Emilia, for providing clarity. You briefly touched on interception, so I think that's a direction that I'm also going to move into. And I'm going to direct this question to you as well, to ask what mechanisms have then been put into place to safeguard against surveillance overreach and abuse, especially as it relates to interception? And what role will CRAN and service providers play as it relates to the interception of data? I know you've already clarified that this law does not particularly then make provision for the interception of data, as that has been something that has already been made provision for and that is ongoing. But in light of the new regulations, what would the role of CRAN and service providers be, and what mechanisms have then been put into place to safeguard against surveillance overreach and interception?
Thank you, Roswitha. I think the first thing is to say CRAN does not intercept. The service providers also do not intercept. Interception happens in terms of the NCIS Act. And that is the process that will be followed. And the operators are already familiar with that process, because even in the absence of SIM registration, if there is a need for us to know the identity of a certain number or the person behind a certain SIM card, or if there is a need for us to know who did Emilia call on this day, did she call Emmanuel, did she call John, and all of that. That process is already there, and it's happening as we are speaking, even in the absence of SIM registration. The only thing that SIM registration does is it complements the interception process. Because what would happen now is you might go to one of the service providers and say, who does this number belong to? The service provider will say, that number has not been registered. We don't know. We can tell you that on the 20th of June, this person made a call from a base station in Windhoek, or on this day, they made a call from Okahanja, but we don't know who the number belongs to. But what SIM registration does is it then reveals the identity behind the number. And the process that is normally followed in terms of the NCIS Act is that you have to go, there must be a case reported with law enforcement. Law enforcement must then go to a judge or to a magistrate and say, we have suspicion that this person or this number is involved in a crime. Can you please authorize that we go to the service provider? The service provider only releases the identity and the data that they have stored pertaining to a number on the strength of the warrant. If there is no warrant, they will not release that information. And that is something that is currently already happening. It's not going to be a new process that will be introduced. And this is why we've been saying over and over that these new conditions do not introduce interception. They only complement it in the sense that we now know the identity behind the owner of the SIM.
The self number. Okay. Thank you so much. John, I would just like to head over to you. With all the talk that has been happening as it relates to interception, from a legal perspective, what risks would you say are there as it relates to interception in Namibia currently? And do these regulations feed into that risk, or in the current context right now, what are the risks associated to interception in Namibia from a legal perspective?
Yeah. Now, I totally hear what Emilia is saying, and I totally understand what she says, that the law as it currently stands already provides for the interception of information. In fact, our constitution is very clear that, of course, no right is absolute. And for that reason, even the right to privacy, the right for your information not to be intercepted without a court order, that is already provided for in our constitution. So no question about that. But our concern is now you are actually making it easier, and I've mentioned it right in the beginning. You are making it easier for rogue elements to do the kind of surveillance, and you've used a very nice word, surveillance overreach, even without a court order, because it is like this. And we've seen how intelligence, for example, has been abused in the in our southern neighbors. The current the current situation of the Palapala farm very much is closely related to some people that had access to information that was gathered for obviously lawful reasons, and we can clearly see how some rogue elements are using that kind of information to fight political battles. And that is what we are saying, that yes, in as much as the law allows for information to be intercepted, that this process is actually making it much easier for people who may want to do with information that they came across for unlawful reasons. My question to Emilia, for example, what is it the business? What business of government is it to know with whom did I speak today, for how long did I speak, and why did I call this particular person? What value does that information add to? And we know you spoke about, in terms of the other pieces of legislation, there's already this kind of information that may be required. But honestly, Emilia, convince us as to why this mandatory SIM card registration what value would it add? I'm still not convinced.
Emilia, would you maybe like to respond to that, or should we rather move on?
Look, we can move on. I think the only issue that we are saying is that we are not making it easy for anyone to do anything. Because if you look at the conditions still cross-refer. It makes, I think it's condition 5, which sets out how the information can be retrieved. And that still refers to a warrant. The information cannot just be shared anyhow. There must be a warrant. And I think it's easy for us to say, what value is it going to add? But as I mentioned in the beginning, this information is already stored. If you need an itemized bill today, all that information that has been narrated is what is going to be used to generate that itemized bill. So the information is already being to be stored. And the point of the matter is that when there is a law enforcement issue that is involved, and those of us that work in this industry know that if a crime is committed, the question would be, who did this person speak to? Who were the people that were involved in the crime? And a lot of times that information is used as intelligence in gathering evidence to prove or disprove that a crime has been committed. We have many people that have been, for instance, defrauded of money. A person will just walk into a service station, buy a SIM card, they take that SIM card, they send all sorts of messages, they receive thousands of dollars, and then they throw it out of the window. We have people who have lost their loved ones. They were last contacted by numbers. Yes, we are able to check these numbers on the network, but nobody knows who this number belongs to. And the biggest one that has also started picking up now is all these threats. People are receiving threats, death threats. Nobody knows who the number belongs to. And the information that will be requested is also not to say that it will always be about who did you speak to, for how long, and all of that. Sometimes all law enforcement needs to know is the identity behind the number. So if I received a death threat and I go and I say that death threat came from this number, I want to open a case, then law enforcement must be able to go to my service provider and say, okay, this number belongs to Rosvita. Rosvita, can you please come in and tell us why you want to kill this person? So we must not just look at it from one side and say, why is it required? What is the validity of the information? What are we going to use it for? There is a serious need for SIM registration. And those of us who are actively involved in this industry, we are inundated with complaints that cannot be resolved simply because we do not know the identity of the numbers. And this is also why we cross-refer everything to the law. And John rightly said the Constitution makes provision for this. Some of these rights and freedoms that are being cited are not absolute. And we have also a lot of times explained that our work is not exclusive. If we believe that the regulation or the condition is not constitutional, then those that believe so must get it tested. Let the courts pronounce themselves. But until then, we believe that whatever was done in good faith, and it's for the interest of Namibians. And the second element, which also needs to come out, is the issue of digital identities. There is a lot of e-commerce going on. There is a lot of technological innovation taking place. And where the world is moving to is you having a digital identity. And SIM registration is one of those first steps that are targeted at ensuring that we have a digital identity. 2 weeks ago, we had the 4IR conference. 4IR is about disruptive innovation, disruptive technological innovation, like you've never seen before. But if as a country we do not have digital identities, how can we even begin to speak about 4IR?
Thank you so much, Emilia. Shinovene, before I come to you, I just would like to follow up on this discussion that we've had between Emilia and John. So from a legal perspective, Mr. Nakuta, one of the things that you've mentioned here is obviously the concerns as it relates to the retention of data. Now, considering that a large amount of data is being retained, for which the probability of all of it being used is unlikely, so we're looking at a tiny proportion of all this data being used by the police or the intelligence services. It's highly unlikely that this data that is being retained, like all of this data that's being retained, will then be requested by the police and or the intelligence service. So from a legal perspective, do you think that it's justified to then retain this massive and this huge amount of data, considering that only a tiny proportion of it might prove useful to, let's say, the police or the intelligence service? Building on the discussion
Yes.
that you two just had.
I understand, and I hope I understand what you are asking. And in law, especially in a human rights, from a human rights perspective, in as much as any right can be limited by a law of general implication, there are several requirements. And the limitation, for example, should not be overly invasive. And so this question that you are asking make me think, for example, that the SIM registration, and I hear what Emilia is explaining, similar registration probably may be justified to a certain extent, but are we not maybe going too far in terms of intruding and invading this right to privacy? And this is something that I think maybe we are going a little bit too far in limiting and restricting the right to privacy, the right to freedom of association, and all these things that goes together with the idea of mandatory SIM card registration. Because yes, in fact, Article 21 of the Constitution says that all rights and freedoms may be limited where there are very strict reasons to do it. And obviously, some of the ones that Emilia referred to, the notion of crime, the notion of state security, public decency, and all those kind of things may be used to limit a right. But the crucial question is the limitation that you are placing on this right. Is it strictly necessary? Secondly, also, is it also proportionate to the end goal that you may want to achieve? The Americans are saying you do not use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. In other words, just do what is strictly necessary and go, and don't be too overzealous to restrict the rights that people are having. And so it is in this context that I understand and answer your question to say that maybe what they want to achieve, they are going way overboard with what they want to achieve, because research has also shown that the notion of preventing crime or fighting crime is mandatory.
Someone else that go to Russia.
Someone is talking in the background.
Okay.
Could you kindly mute the person? Could you kindly mute the person so that I just make my point?
Yes,
Right.
they're muted. My apologies. Also, Mr. Nakuta, could you kindly just speak louder? Apparently, we're having sound
can't hear me.
difficulties from your side.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? I'll talk a little bit louder. But just in conclusion, what I was basically trying to say that in as much as rights may be limited, the law is clear. Any limitation placed on any given right may be strictly necessary and may be proportionate to the end goal that you ultimately would want to achieve. As I said, the Americans are having the saying that you do not use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And lastly, research also shows that the notion of the idea of mandatory SIM card registration in the name of fighting crime really hasn't proven to, empirical evidence actually shows that it did not achieve that stated goal in many countries where it was registered and whatever. In fact, they are saying that actually it drives the illegal market, and people are instead, like for example in Pakistan, I've read that people have opted to start an illegal market of SIM cards. So that is what is happening. Where you close this door, criminals would find another way, anyway, to do what they would want to do. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, you have. Thank you so much for that contribution, Mr. Nakuta. Now, I would please like to implore our participants to please keep their mics switched off while the panelists are talking. The floor is now open to questions, so you guys may post your questions either to Emilia, to John, or to Shinovene, but please raise up your hands or make use of the chat where we will be able to see your questions. Right, so while we wait for questions from the floor, I'd like to move on to you, Shinovene. As a journalist and as somebody that is a media practitioner, what role do you believe the media has played and should continue to play as the fourth estate in making sure that Namibia and Namibians are properly informed as it relates to this issue moving forward? I know earlier when we had the discussion, you briefly spoke about misinformation, disinformation, and the likes. And I think the media, to a very large degree, has a very large say as it relates to disinformation and misinformation, whether it be propagating that or then setting the narrative straight for the ordinary Namibian.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question, and I just wanted to rewind quickly to Emilia's comment that where she admits that truly the current campaign is more aligned to SIM registration. I hope that maybe in the future, or hopefully in the few days, hopefully not too late, you can still amend your campaign so that you include the concept of data retention, which is key. Otherwise, CRAN will definitely be seen as running a deceptive campaign, because we're just focusing on SIM registration. Because frankly, she has a point that we need to fight crime and by all means use all digital opportunities available for the state entities. But our concern has always been oversight. The lack of oversight is what's going to cause state organizations in terms of why they have they're enacting the Section 6 without oversight. Is always going to be abused, and that is everywhere. That includes Africa, where journalists had to challenge certain section of that law. In Namibia, we might not have such capacity yet, but I hope that the South African lesson helps others to learn a lesson from there, to understand that even though they really mean well and everything, surely, because I will want to know from CRAN themselves, even from this campaign, to explain to us, this is what we want to do, right? We want to enforce this section, but as a key role, I remember even the president had reminded everyone that, look, we are not going to spy anyone for just for the sake of it. Assure the public this is what they are going, these are the steps they are going to take to ensure that post privacy is not stamped on. Things like that. Because for sure, I'm sure, even in the US, they have oversights of key state organs like intelligence and all other communication regulators. In Namibia, you do not see an entity like intelligence being questioned by Parliament, which is supposed to be. Now, when you don't have such oversight, that's where our biggest problem is. Oversight, that's when the role of journalists already becomes very skeptical in the approach of, let's say, CRAN or the Ministry of Information or the National Intelligence. So the role at the moment, just to answer your question now, is I think we will still continue to having to question the motives of CRAN, the motive of Ministry of Information. We are going to be skeptical of their motive. We are going to be as responsible and as humanly to understand their motive. At the moment, when you hear Emilia talking, you will accept her reason, which is really her role. But our caution as journalists is we're not going to accept her explanation without having to assure or providing certain regulatory legal framework that will provide some protection to the citizens. I think that's our role, I think, to the journalists, to still listen to the explanation given, but to remain highly skeptical.
Thank you so much, Shinovene. We have a hand up. Robert Shipanga, you're recognized. You may pose your question. Robert?
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me?
Could you just please speak a bit louder? We can't hear you.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. I just want to be in support of the registration process. I think my biggest issue is just the way the data is being stored. Normally, if you had to look at other African countries, the regulator basically store the data in terms of obviously and overseeing the mobile operators. I'm coming from the financial fintech industry. We also need to get access to that data. And the current process is the mobile operator, basically they are registering the member themselves. And I do not know if there's an opportunity for us to get access to that data to be able to register, let's say, for example, for wallets, mobile wallets for the users. And obviously looking at things like if someone obviously, for example, send money to someone by mistake, so we can be able to trace that person. So I think my concern now obviously is just that the current process, the mobile operators are basically doing the registration themselves. For example, I've seen Nigeria, for example, the regulator owns the platform where the registration has been made. If there's people who are not registered, they'll be able to switch off. So that's basically my concern that I do not know. Obviously, the mobile operators are also commercial. They're also looking at the sector that we are playing in. I don't know if they're going to give us access to that data for us also to provide financial services. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that contribution, Robert. Do any one of our panelists maybe want to dive into that, dissect, comment, add, minus, or the contribution stands as it does?
If I may, Rosvita, thank you.
Sure, Emilia.
Yes, I think there's numerous approaches to storing the data, and Shipanga is right in that there is some regulators who would have a central database, and that is where the data is captured. And then you also have other regulators where they leave it up to the operators, and then we just have a monitoring and evaluation and compliance platform to make sure that the data is then captured, and that if there are SIM cards that are not registered, then the directive would be issued to switch off those. And the issue about who would have access to the data, I think the regulation would set out the different categories, but I like the experience that he's sharing from the financial industry, because like I said, one of the reasons that we are registering is firstly national security, individual safety, but also from a technological perspective to make sure that you have a digital identity to allow financial service providers to, for instance, launch the fintech concepts which are becoming so I think I will leave it there.
All right. Okay. To our participants, the floor is still open for questions. We have around about 10 minutes before we wrap up. So if you have any questions or you need clarity on this topic, the time is now. But I'm now going to hand over to my panelists to then just make their final remarks. But before we get to that, I would just like to ask Emilia, if you could just please give us an overview of the National SIM Registration Consumer Awareness Campaign, the purpose, what we can expect, how long it will run for, and all of that before you head into your final remarks.
Okay, thanks, Rosvita. The campaign was launched on the 7th of June this year. It's a 6-month campaign. It will run until the 31st of December. The campaign is targeted at sensitizing the public and consumers about the requirement to register SIM cards. But as I mentioned earlier, it will also unravel the other requirements that are introduced by the registration conditions. The campaign would be in the form of, would have roadshows across the country. The campaign material will also be translated into some of our local languages just to make sure that no one is left out. We will predominantly use social media, radio, and television, as well as print media as our source of campaign information dissemination. And the 4 phases would really be aimed at ensuring, firstly, that people understand the requirement. Then we'll have a second phase that will go into the more detailed requirements of what the campaign is about. And then the last 2 phases will be aimed at just reminding the consumers on what the requirements would be. I think my concluding remarks would really just be to say that for us as regulator, SIM registration is an important component of the ICT ecosystem. It's designed primarily to ensure national security as well as individual safety, but also most importantly, to enable us to benefit from the technological innovation landscape, where the whole world is moving to is people having digital IDs. We are aware of the issues around data protection and all of that, but as I mentioned, it's nothing unique to the ICT industry. In the meantime, we have put in place mechanisms that the operators would follow to ensure that that data is secure until we have the broader framework of the data protection laws. The issues around the right to privacy, freedom of expression, and all of that, I think we have also dealt with that. And what we are really saying is that everything that is guaranteed in the Constitution would be followed. But at the same time, if there are citizens that are truly aggrieved by this interventions, then this is why we have the courts, and CRAN is a law-abiding citizen. We've always abide by whatever outcome or direction that the courts would give us. So we'll just encourage the public to go out there and really participate, get information, be informed so that you can make the right decision. And the right decision is you must register your SIM to keep your. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Emilia. Now, before I move on to John and Shinovene's final remarks, we actually have 2 questions. I think they might be directed at you, but I think anybody else can answer. So the first one is from Shalongo Angula, and he's asking, so what happens if one fails to register their SIM card? Will the mobile operators cut them off?
Yes, you will be cut. You will call one day and the lady will not be saying there's insufficient credit or anything. They'll be saying you failed to register. This is why we are saying the right decision is for you to register your SIM to keep your number.
Okay, thank you. Last question, and this is from Ms. Elizabeth Ipinge, and she's asking, are our telecommunications companies, or do our telecommunications company already have the infrastructure in place to store this large amount of data?
Yes, they do. They are already storing the data. The only thing that the conditions do is it now makes it mandatory. But what we have also done is we have established a SIM registration preparedness committee, which is made up of all the operators that issue SIM cards. and we are then busy taking them through the process to make sure that we eliminate all hiccups come the 1st of January when they need to start registering. But what we have seen, for instance, MTC has already started with the registration because they do have about 2.4 million customers to register. So they've already started. So the operators are fully briefed and they are on board. They are just waiting for the consumers to come and register.
Thank you so much, Emilia. Okay, John, you're next up. If you could please just give us your final thoughts and any wisdom of nuggets that you probably have to share with us before you leave us.
Right. Now, thank you very much, Rosvita. Listening to...
It makes me really think of, in fact, it will be interesting to know how they go around intercepting data from WhatsApp and other apps, but that's probably a topic from another day. But my probably speaking from a journalist perspective, I'll probably always urge our audiences who want to give tips to us to always have that in mind, to always assume that because what we do is nothing, it's not against the law. What we do is often to review things that state doesn't want us to report on. So you are free to often either use Signal as a platform to contact us so that we can either do public justice to certain issues that need public interest. So I will always urge, no matter how affected you are, you must always take reasonable steps to make sure that you do not expose yourself to, so that you can either be victimized for contacting a journalist. So you always try and do your basic research to avoid exposing yourself, because sometimes even the story is not that big to expose yourself. So try and do every step possible and ask the journalist what steps you can take so that you are not exposed. So we are available to always provide tips, means on how you can provide us with information without having to expose yourself through the latest steps that are taken.
Okay. Once again, thank you so much, Ms. Emilia, Mr. John, Mr. Shinovene. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day and for joining us for this critical discussion. To all our participants, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for the questions. And that is it from us, the experts in the Namibia Media Trust. Hopefully we'll see you guys next time for the 5th installment of Ask the Expert. Once again, thank you so much for your time.